Hello, and thank you for choosing to watch another New Life video. I'm Matt with New Life Church, and we're continuing our study of the heroes of faith listed in Hebrews chapter 11. This week we will be beginning the study of one of the most famous men in the Bible, Moses. We'll first look at where he's mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11 before we begin the book of Exodus. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23, it says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible." We'll stop reading there, because it'll get a lot further into his life when we continue, but we're going to the book of Exodus, chapter 1. Verse 1 says, "Now these are the names of children of Israel who came out of Egypt," and it gives a very long list that that we can skip. But verse 5, "All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already, and Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them." You may recall from previous lessons, we talked all about Joseph's life, how he ended up being second only to Pharaoh, because he kept on serving God no matter what circumstances he found himself into. And those circumstances were a lot worse than I would guess any that you've been in or I've been in. You can serve God through anything. Yes, when you fall, God will forgive you, but you do not have to fall.
Amen.
But Joseph, while he was second to Pharaoh, he basically got all the riches of Egypt that it had. You know, he's the one who knew that the famine was coming and prepared for it. And so in verse 8 it says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." So what this means, someone who does not recognize the contribution that Joseph had. Could have been a different dynasty. The Bible's not specific. There are different things said. But the point is that all that Joseph did for Egypt is forgotten by the leader in Egypt. "And he said to his people, 'Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply.' And it happened, in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land." So, he noticed there were a lot of Israelites there. So he thought the way to make sure they're not his enemy is to do everything he could to make them his enemy. I mean, if there's someone I don't want to become my enemy, I will be friendly to them. Mm-hmm. I'll be really good to them so that in the time of trouble, they'll be good to me. So he's also an idiot. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people in leadership that are idiots, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And so he did something very cruel. He called it being shrewd. It wasn't being shrewd. Being terrible to them. So verse 11 says, "Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses." So they were put to labor. They were slaves. These people who had come up, well, their ancestors had come up as guests of the second only to Pharaoh. Actually, guests of Pharaoh. He was very happy. He told Joseph to get his family there. The Pharaoh of Joseph's time. Now they're being afflicted. Turned into slaves, forced to work. But the more, in verse 12, the more they afflicted, page stuck together as happens in many Bibles and other things, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. So they thought they afflict them, they're not gonna multiply as much. There's not gonna be as many kids if everybody's put to slave labor. But the more they did that, the more children of Israel grew, and that Pharaoh and others were more and more in dread of Israel. So what happens when you act in fear? You usually make the situation worse.
Yeah. You act in fear, you act in stupidity.
Yes. You act in fear, you act in stupidity. And there's some more stupidity and cruelty. Verse 13. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. That means they made it worse. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. So it's even worse. But that wasn't enough for Pharaoh. To really put them to hard labor wasn't enough. Then the king of Egypt, in verse 15, spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife, which is helping them deliver babies, for the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. And that's terrible, almost as bad as abortions today. And I do mean that. Doctors will recommend that all the time. You know, when you read in the Bible about that idea, you know it's horrible, but for some reason, if you give it a medical term of abortion, it's fine. But I digress. Now these people, these midwives, it says in verse 17, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? Yeah, so he realized that these male children were still being born and still being brought up, so he calls them. Says, why haven't you done this? Can't possibly occur to him that someone fears God. Can't possibly occur to him that someone doesn't want to murder a baby. And the midwives said to Pharaoh, they made this up, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. So they said, these women are just giving birth real fast. They go into labor, someone sends for the midwife, but before the midwife even gets there, they've already given birth. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. So it was because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, that's the Nile River, and every daughter you shall save alive. So now he's skipping the midwives altogether, just telling the people, you have a son, you throw him in the river. And that is, I'm not sure if in history any king has ordered something more cruel than that. I mean, there's a lot of cruel things that have been ordered in history, but to tell people to kill their own kids? So chapter 2 is where we get to Moses. And a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. When she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. So for 3 months she's just keeping him hidden in the house, doing her best to make sure nobody knows he's around. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, and put the child on it, laid it on the reeds by the river's bank. So what was the king's order? Every son who is born you shall cast into the river. So what did she do? She put him in the river.
Yep.
She just added a few other steps to give him a chance of survival. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." So she realized correctly that it was one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, this is kind of funny to me, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. So what happened? Moses' mother got paid
To raise her son.
Yeah.
to raise her son. Quite clever, quite interesting, quite funny to me. So verse 10, "And the child grew and became her son." As we'd mentioned, the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So she called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." The name Moses literally means drawn out. Now it came to pass in verse 11, in those days, when Moses was grown, he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So Moses knew what he was. And he sees this. He sees something that's been happening many, many times during his whole lifetime. An Egyptian is beating a Hebrew. So verse 12, what does he do? So he looked this way and that way. And when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So what is he doing? Seems to me he's got an idea that he's going to start working on freeing the Hebrews. He's got this idea. He's going to kill this one, and he probably would plan on killing the next one he sees like that. Just slowly trying to do things. But that wasn't the way that God wanted it done. He had a good enough goal, but sometimes we have an idea of what should be done, but we're supposed to do things God's way. He just starts off doing it this way, just kills him. So verse 13, "And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting, and he said to the one who did the wrong, 'Why are you striking your companion?' Then he said, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Now, a few verses ago, when Moses was about to kill that Egyptian, what did he do? Look to the left and the right and every which way. He didn't see anyone, but guess what?
Someone saw him.
Someone saw him. It is known. So Moses feared and said, "Surely this thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. So he realized that he is wanted for murder one. He is wanted for murder. So what does he do?
Runs.
He runs. He gets far away from Egypt. So he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, in verse 16. And they came and drew water, and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away. Well, that was nice, wasn't it?
Yeah. Wonderful, nice guys driving these ladies away.
Yeah, great neighborly people, huh?
Neighbors like that, who needs enemies?
Yeah. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. So Moses did the right thing there, even though all these shepherds were doing the wrong thing. When they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "How is it that you have come so soon today?" What does that mean?
This happens all the time.
This happens all the time. They go out there, they try to start, the shepherds come, drive them away, then the shepherds do whatever they're doing, and eventually the shepherds leave and they can finally get the flocks watered. But this time, they are a lot earlier. And it must have been significantly, since I doubt he had a Timex or a Rolex.
Yeah.
So they were noticeably early. And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds. He also drew enough water for us and watered the flock." So they explained, and obviously that means, what did Moses look like?
Egyptian.
An Egyptian. He's wearing Egyptian clothes and demeanor. I doubt that's what he looked like later on, but at this time he's just fled from Egypt. So he looks like an Egyptian. So verse 20. So he said to his daughters, "And where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." You know, why didn't you invite him over? Just left him? You know. Then Moses was content to live with the man. He didn't only just get a meal from him. He was invited to live there, and even more. And he gave Zipporah his daughter to Moses. So he got a wife, and she bore him a son. He called his name Gershom. Literally means stranger. For he said, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land." Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out. And their cry came up to God because of their bondage. God does hear us when we cry. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. So what do we learn from this, from these 2 chapters? Well, one thing is, like the midwives, the government told them to do something that was wrong.
And they didn't do it.
You know, I've heard the excuse, I was following orders, doing. But they wouldn't do it. They could have been killed. They didn't know whether they would or not.
Perfect God rather than men.
So then you get also Moses' parents, Moses' mother. Technically obeying the government, but
Yeah.
adding that ark so they had a chance. Then you have Moses, who had a good goal of freeing the children of Israel, but was not doing it God's way. Sometimes we can get that way. So I think it's important that we pray for God's will. Because you can do something that you think is right, or maybe even the general goal is right, but if you don't do it God's way, it ain't going to work. It's not going to prosper. And so Moses had to flee. But you know what? Even when he fled, God was with him. And we started doing the right thing, helping out. He gained so far a whole family. He gained a family. And one thing to think about with Moses, what he gave up. Even though the way that he tried to accomplish his goal was wrong anyway, but think about it. If he decided he didn't want to help Israel, what was in store for him? At the very minimum, he would be a prince forever in Egypt.
Yeah.
That's at a minimum if he didn't become the next Pharaoh. He had the riches of Egypt at his disposal. He'd gotten the best education that the world had at that time.
Yeah.
He would have had a luxurious life. But what did Hebrews say? And remember what it said. In Hebrews 11, verse 24, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. For he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. You know, he had to flee Egypt. He had to flee everything he knew. And he became, for this time, a nobody. We'll read it for 40 years, just a shepherd. From being a prince of Egypt to a shepherd, that had to be quite a change, you know. In just a few days' time, he went from being a big shot to a nobody. Simply because he refused to watch the affliction of the people of Israel. Even though he didn't go about things the right way, he still knew that it was wrong. And that's something we all need to realize, we all need to do, is not be part of the problem. Not be part of the problem around us when wrong is happening. We also need to obey God and do things God's way. Even when God's way doesn't seem as logical to us as whatever we would try to do. We need to just keep trusting in God. I hope this has been a blessing to you. If it has, please comment, like this, share, subscribe. And we'd love to hear from you. So until next time, go with God.